Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Harshit Kukreja. Today as my guest, I have my colleague Mahek. Hey Mahek, how are you?
I'm good, Harshit. Thank you for having me. It's actually over a month that I've recorded a podcast. So like it's 15 back.
Yeah, I think we'll call you more frequently now. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about it.
So in today's episode, we'll talk about the climate change emergency. We'll talk about what is happening in Europe and North America. We'll talk about what India can do about it and what is our situation right now. Before we go into all that, Mehak will give you guys a quick introduction about our courses.
Yeah. So of course, for like people who have come back, they would know that apart from being a think tank and a research place, Takshashila also runs short courses, 12-week courses in public policy. So there are 3 courses which are starting in the month of September for graduate certificate in public policy. There are 3 streams: advanced public policy for people who want to understand the nuances of public policy, how governments function, how media functions, how to write policy. There's one stream called advanced public policy. Then there is technology and policy. And as the name suggests, you try to study the dynamics between how technology evolves and how it shapes around public policy and public policy discourse. And then third, we have defense and foreign affairs, where you learn about Arthashastra, you learn about Kautilya, you learn about strategic affairs, you learn about how countries function in situations of crisis. So the applications are now current, are now open and running. So apply for our 12-week public policy courses and they start in the month of September.
Thanks for the plug. So I think it has been since last week, the temperatures in Europe, basically Britain, France, Greece, Spain, and have been reaching unprecedented numbers. There have been droughts, there have been forest fires. Something similar was also happening in India, I think around 2 months back, when the summers, at least in summers, the days and even the nights were getting hotter. There were a lot of heat waves coming in. We could not get respite from the heat. So, Mehak, could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so as you rightly pointed out, Harshit, last week there is news all over that Europe has been facing the worst heat waves ever. And countries like Great Britain, there have been heat waves in Spain, Greece, France, and have been forest fires. And like to the point that people actually have been forced to sit at home and even work from home. Several companies across these countries have given work from home and asked people to not to move out. There has been a huge risk for the wildlife in the forest because of the fire. And but before this, also I would also want to talk about what happened 2 months back in our home. So in India, this time we observed great, like disastrous heat waves in the month of May. The country was swept away with it, and there were like the year recorded over 250 heat wave days between like till the month of May, and which has been the highest in last, I think, in the last decade. And apart from this, even our bordering country, Pakistan, saw extreme heat waves in their country. And one of the cities called Jacobabad, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, also became the hottest city on the planet. Of course, we'll talk more about how it impacts women and children more than men in later part of this podcast. But of course, most people in that city and in Pakistan and even in India are actually, it's basically become a daily phenomenon for them, and they're living on the edge of climate change. And not only in India and Pakistan, we also know what happened in southern and eastern parts of China. They also face unprecedented high temperatures recently. And that's why we haven't experienced something like this before. And it's so rapid that climate change is actually standing at our doorsteps now, and the catastrophic events are now being experienced by everyone. Of course, earlier we used to talk about how it was affecting the developing nations more, and it was the fault of the developing nations. But now that as we are moving year by year, we are realizing that the effects of heat waves, the effects of global warming, carbon emissions are impacting everybody around the world. Of course, it's impacting differently for different people, but it's the time that we act upon it. There is no more time left for us because it's become a daily reality to just think and ponder upon it and just have conferences and summits to discuss things about climate change. It's now the time that we act about it and not only adapt but also mitigate.
Yeah, I think it is like high time we stopped pretending to care about it and do something about it. Because from what I understand, our models had underestimated the rise in climate. The rise in temperature has been more faster than what we anticipated. And I think it would be quite an impossible task to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, actually, not even 1.5 or shit. Like earlier, we had the target of 2 degrees, and now that we're moving at such a fast, unprecedented rate that we never know when we hit that. And I think a lot of people don't realize or don't know that climate change has always been a natural phenomenon. We know that there was a snow age, we know there was an ice age, and we know the temperatures have been rising, but we also need to understand what is it actually that is causing climate change with such a rapid, to such a rapid speed. We know it was I think it is. I don't think. I think it's a truth that it was during the Industrial Revolution. It was actually when anthropogenic activity became so fast, or they became to a level that the planet couldn't match up to, and that's when the process of climate change became started getting faster. The temperature started rising, and we also need to understand that what we study about climate change is not how we perceive climate change 100 years back. There have, of course, has been evolution. If you look at 100 years ago, we would only talk about, oh, something's happening with fossil fuels. We knew about it, but we didn't know that global temperatures are actually rising. Then we started seeing weather patterns changing. In 1970s, we realized that what was actually causing it. We started setting up some targets. We had Stockholm conference that we have first, then later in 1990s, we have the Rio conference. And so it is always evolved. And now we have reached to a point that we can actually say that climate change is not a phenomenon that affects one part of the world. It affects everybody. And since it affects everybody, it's everybody's responsibility to combat it. Everybody has their own share to do things to probably control it. And I also want to say that it's inevitable. Probably what we should try to do right now is we, of course, can't reverse a lot of things that have already happened, but we can try to probably stop of what's already not happened. I don't know how many of our listeners are aware about this, but there is something called Earth Overshoot Day. So Earth Overshoot. So every year we have some resources. The human beings around the world have some resources to use. And when we cross those resources for that particular year, whatever we are using for rest of that year is borrowed from the subsequent years. So earlier, when this was starting to get calculated, it was actually in the month of October. Now it's come out to July. This time it's 20th July, which is the fastest we have ever crossed the Earth overshoot day. Last year it was 29th. And of course, 2020, it was in the month of August also because there was massive lockdown across the globe and industries weren't functioning. Of course, the temperature rise wasn't happening as steadily as it happens in other years. But these things tell us that we are actually adding every year to the process of climate change. Like when we see like Assam is going through floods, Meghalaya is going through floods. Every year we have floods, we have droughts, we have avalanches, we have landslides. And I'm not saying these are not natural, but the frequency of them happening is actually a proof that something is wrong and we're doing something wrong. And that's why we need to work upon it.
Yeah, obviously, we are using a lot of resources which we are borrowing from the future generations. And there's an argument for common but differentiated responsibilities. That is, all the developed nations, they did their fair share of economic growth, industrialization, and they have contributed a lot of these emissions which are causing this man-made climate change. But they have to understand, they do understand obviously, but they're not ready to give us that space that developing countries like India and obviously China, we have to take the people out, we have to take our population out of poverty. And for that, we need some scope to get out of, to industrialize, to develop. That is an
Yeah.
important task. And yeah,
Correct. But I agree, completely agree with you that climate action is a shared responsibility and an international coordinated effort is the greatest hope for probably limiting the terrible repercussions that climate change holds for all of us. And that's why no country can refuse to pay its fair share. And the pressure shouldn't always be on developing nations. Like, I don't know if you've heard about it, it's always like it's blamed upon how Delhi is the most polluted city in the world, or how China is emitting the most amount of emissions. But I agree with all of that we it's only through togetherness and probably consolidated efforts that we'll be able to achieve the global of zero carbon emissions. But I also want to say that since developing nations are now expanding their urbanization efforts and are on the stage of development, they also have the opportunity to rethink about all of this and probably plan their construction strategies around it. Our systems have to be made resilient, our systems have to be made sustainable so that future generations try to understand the need of sustainable living. And for the future, for us to be feasible, we have to, of course, we also have in the global south, we know that there's a resource scarcity and there's, of course, resources related tensions. These add up as hindrances to the sustainable style of development or sustainable style of living. But now it's also the time that we realize that we have the opportunity to not to repeat the same mistake that probably a lot of developed nations did. I also know that a lot of people say that since developed nations have already done it, developing countries also should get the right to probably go on that trajectory. I said we'll have to. There is no way we can avoid it. Environmentalism in itself is a full stomach phenomenon. We actually have problems of shelter, food, and poverty. And of course, people in the country cannot really think about environmentalism as a process, as a phenomenon. But I also think that we, at the time, people who have that opportunity should also take the leverage of it and try not to repeat the things or the mistakes that a lot of developed nations have done to reach a particular stage of economic development.
Very rightly said. Environmentalism is a
There's stomach phenomenon, of
yeah,
course.
yeah, it's a full stomach phenomenon. Yeah, but we can go on a better trajectory. We can cut our emissions. We can skip stages of development, which were the most polluting. We can shift from coal, all the fossil fuels. But for that, we need a little flexibility. And because all these technologies, all these low polluting technologies have a very high upfront cost, we need access to funding. We
Correct.
need
And
tech
that
transfers.
I think developed nations should step in. And like that's why they have to help us to probably also economically grow, but also grow at a very sustainable form of development. And that's the only way I think we can achieve the SDGs. Okay, we know that we did set MDGs for 2015. We have SDGs for 2030. Are we really going to achieve them if we do not follow a particular trajectory? If we keep repeating the same mistakes, we know there are so many planetary boundaries that we have already transgressed. Like I think there are only one transplanted boundary that we haven't trusted, and that also we'll do it in a couple of years. So we know there's something that we're doing massively wrong. But I completely agree with you with the point of I think like it's how it's revolving is that developed nations are still polluting, massively polluting. And it's actually the impact on the people who are living in the global south. And that's why um, where the topic of climate justice comes in, and that's it's very important to define and comprehend the concept of climate justice in itself. We know, if we still look at the numbers, we know that an average American would, I think in a recent study it was said that it pollutes, an average American pollutes over 20 times more than an average Nigerian and over 10 times than an average Indian. So we know, if you look at Saudi Arabia or if you look at Russia, they have carbon emissions drastically, even when they have reached some certain stage of economic development and they have all the resources to probably combat that. There are countries like China, Brazil, India who are always blamed, and there is no discussion about the historical context of what's been happening to our atmosphere. Today, everybody talks about how China is big, but China in the recent year, of course, has improved a lot after their administration changed at the higher level. They have been trying to control a lot of their emissions. But I also think that what happens in the developed world is also affecting people in the developing or poor world, and people don't even know about it. Farmers are suffering everywhere. There have been droughts, there have been floods. Food production is going low. People are not having actually food. There is, of course, agricultural output has been affected. Homes have been destroyed. There have been massive income losses. And the sad part is people who are experiencing it are not even aware of what's happening in the other part of the world. And that's where, to protect the devastating impact in global south, every person across the globe has to step up. Every country has to step up. We know in a few years some islands would not exist. And that's what's also every year more and more islands are under administration are trying to find land for their people because they know in a couple of years they won't even exist because sea levels are rising. I was recently reading a study how about some people who were interviewed from Goa, and they have actually experienced it, whose actually houses were nearer to the beach, nearer to the shore. And they have experienced that sea levels are rising, sea is coming more closer and closer to their homes. So we know it's happening, it's right in front of us. And we have signed Rio Plus 20, we have signed Copenhagen, we have done. First of all, a lot of countries don't even ratify to it. And even somebody who ratify and they become a signatory later, they don't even always fulfill their promises. And the that's where we know that the people are still thinking about their own well-being. They're not thinking about climate change as a global phenomenon. We know from that in Kyoto Protocol, a lot of developed nations did back out later. We know the US also backed out later from Paris Agreement. So we know these things are happening. It's just because they're not able to achieve the target. For example, Canada had to cut down their emissions to a certain level after the Kyoto was signed. And when it was supposed to get over, to the contradictory, their emissions were higher than ever before, and later they backed out of it. So we know that people are not actually holding up and they're not giving their fair share of responsibility towards every citizen of this world.
Yeah, make very, very rightly said. Before we continue, let us take a short break and we'll come back. Hey, listeners, welcome back. So, we were talking about how the developed countries are not ready to take responsibilities for their actions and are also not helping us out to develop while being climate aware. So, I think this was a promise the developed countries made that they'll fund somewhere around 100 billion per year for climate adaptation by 2020. But this has now joined in the list of broken promises. And if you're not ready to put your money and your resources and your expertise, I don't think we'll be able to see a lot of change in the situation. And 1.52 degrees seems very
Yeah,
unlikely to achieve.
much tougher now than we ever planned it for. We won't be able to achieve it until and unless people are taking responsibility and are holding their accountability. And reduced accountability on some nations would, of course, undoubtedly place a burden on other nations. And we know that's what's been happening. And so I just want to reiterate that there are of course loopholes in all of the agreements that have been signed. There have been no sanctions in place actually put for governments of countries who fail to follow their promises and their obligations, and that's why it's so easy for a country to just back out. It's so easy for Donald Trump to stand on a wintry night giving a speech to the Pan Americans saying we need heat where is climate change. And for him, it's a joke, but it is really not. And but we know that there are people like him who still don't believe that climate change really exists. And so that's why since we need harsher regulations, we need developing countries to be invested with financial resources to help poorer countries and adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. And that's why there's an imperative need for not only climate action, but also, yeah, climate justice.
Yeah, I think now that a lot of Western countries are seeing the effects of climate change, maybe this attitude will change and maybe we'll see better funding and better resources and better focus, more focus to climate. But I think we cannot now only call it climate change. It's a climate emergency. It's not only climate change. It's not a
Yeah.
subtle, slow process which is going on and maybe it's running in the background and something we'll see 100 years post. Then it's a new reality for the next generation. So even though India has not been a major contributor to overall global emission, we think we will have to make huge cuts in our
Yeah.
emissions if we have to first of all, be responsible for our own future and be responsible for what happens around us. Second of all, meet our obligations. For instance, what we made in the COP26 meet.
Yeah.
Obviously, this includes pressurizing the rich countries and pressurizing the developed countries to drastically reduce their emissions and help us and help other countries which are under resourced to reduce theirs. And while they're helping the developing countries or the underdeveloped countries or the poor countries, give them some leeway, give them a range so that they can industrialize and also be climate aware.
Yeah, exactly. Like we, of course, developed nations have to keep putting their effort and have to step up. But I also think like as basic as what we can do in our country is just to provide education related to climate change to all students. That's it's very important. And I know India is one of the very few countries which has like environmental education compulsory for all students, and that was after 1991 court case and the order by Supreme Court of India against MC Mehta. But I also think that it's very theoretical right now. I had read about global warming, I had read about different kinds of pollution, but it wasn't it wasn't later until I read a lot of other books and I saw news reports that I was really worried about climate change. Or maybe when I was very young, it wasn't right on my face. And now that I'm more aware, I can see things happening around me. That's why it's very important for children to be educated about climate change. We know recently, so just correct me if I was wrong, it was NCRT or was it CBSE which tried to cut off climate change chapters?
Yeah, so it was
Yes.
CBSE it was CBSE who very recently tried to, because they said because of COVID there has been a lot of time loss.
That's the sad part is there are so many other chapters that we can actually remove and we choose to remove the hardest reality. We choose to remove climate change. And of course, later after the Teachers Association put out a letter, and of course there was a lot of pressure on the body to get it back. It was reintroduced, but it's so saddening to see that we don't take it seriously even now. So that's why I keep on reiterating. Like it starts from education. We are trying to achieve 100% literacy. We can also achieve uh, younger generation, which is of course going to take on their leading roles and in future for them to be very sensitive about climate change, because until and unless they are aware and sensitive to it, there is no way we are going to achieve and probably mitigate the effects and the risks of climate change.
So I like to give a personal anecdote. So one of my friends used so unless you do some things when the children are young, there is a very little chance that people will grow up as adults and try to like look it up or see the logic or whatever. So unless we teach people basics of climate change, how to mitigate it, how to what are the risk factors, everything else, these won't become the future citizens which will pressurize the government. So the example I was about to give, one of my friends had that herbal soap. Yeah, it's called the herbal soap or something. So, but she was pretty confident that it removes and it kills the germs and it removes the dirt. But it has no chemical composition in it, which was basically chemically structured that soap. So it this is a very simple example because I was taught, and obviously she was also taught, and it was she forgot or whatever. So because I was taught how the soap structure works and how the soap works on dirt and how it takes up oil and everything else, I was able to look at it and say that no, this doesn't work. So unless children are taught about climate, unless they're taught about, and instead of cutting down the syllabus, that was a very not so good move. I would advocate for more climate literacy, and not only in children, even in adults.
Yeah, I think that's again like we have to make people sensitive. We have to make actually people aware first of what's happening. A lot of people are not even aware of what's happening and why is it happening. A lot of people just say, okay, the rains are not happening or there are more rains this year. But like, do we know that why are rain patterns getting changed? Why are more and more regions becoming more and more prone to drought. And I think that's why basic level of education and awareness is important for all citizens across the country. We also have to start living sustainably. We can't just try to live a very luxurious life, and when it actually hinders the planet, we know there is no planet B. This is what it is, and we need the future generations to also experience nature. It's also very, not getting the word. It's actually injustice, or it's not right or disrespectful for them when you're trying to bring them to the world and probably offering them a world which is this polluted, which is this dirty. We don't have fresh air, we don't have fresh water. Water resources are scarce now. We know more and more conflicts are happening because of scarcity of resources. So it's actually unfair for them to bring in them to the world and probably exposing them to all of these realities. And for protecting the vulnerable and protecting everybody from the brunt of the cost of climate change, we have to understand that there is only limited amount of time that is left for us to think about drought mitigation aims, and we'll only be able to achieve it if we work globally.
Yeah, so obviously that would be an injustice to the future generations if we are leaving them the planet as this. For what I think one of the most important things that we as a country can do is shift to cleaner fuels. A
Yeah.
lot, a majority of our energy supply comes from coal, oil, biomass. And this shift means obviously replacing the existing capacity, but also adding new renewable energy capacity. That is adding new solar, wind, even nuclear, because nuclear is very clean. And the risk of accident and everything else, that is obviously a perception thing. And now the technology has improved a lot, but nuclear is very clean. And I think maybe some kind of a in-country green carbon credit system in which everybody has a cap. Every industry or every sort of like area or however divided has a cap on how much they can pollute. And if somebody wants to pollute more than that, they can get sort of like the carbon allocation from another industry or another sort of like area, so that people can now trade carbon credits. And that would help a lot of people who can reduce their carbon emission to get funds for getting them to reduce. And they would also help a lot of high polluters. They will all This would also incentivize a lot of high polluters to decrease their carbon emissions because of the high cost associated with it.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. We still have so many options to better our actions, and I hope that every country tries to step in and help others, because I would want to reiterate that there is no planet. This is what we have, and we have to take care of it.
Yeah. Very, very right said. So I think this brings our discussion to a close. Meg, do you want to add something?
And no, Harshit, I want to appeal to all our listeners that just try to, whatever best possible way in your action, just try to be more sustainable. I know it's a very privileged thing to say. Living sustainably is also very expensive, but like in short, actions, just trying to save life, trying to electricity, trying to save water is our bit of contribution towards mitigating the risks.
Yeah, very, very. This was a very good discussion. Thanks, Meg, for helping out and for being such a good speaker. Okay, thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.